On a Friday afternoon in April, a 16-year-old girl walked home from school and noticed something wrong before she even reached the porch. The front door of her house was standing open, not wide open, just enough. As she stepped toward it, someone pulled it shut in her face. A man's voice, muffled through the wood, told her to wait. When he finally came outside, he had an explanation ready. Her mother, he said, had stormed off after an argument. They would go look for her together. He did not let the girl step inside the house first. For the next 2 days, that girl would call her mother's phone again and again. It would never be answered, because by the time that front door closed on her, the woman inside would not walk out of that house alive. Before we get into what really happened inside that home on Jerry Lewis Way, I want to ask you for something quick. Right now, more than 90% of the people watching this are not subscribed to this channel. If you want more cases like this one, hit that subscribe button, tap like on this video, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We are actively looking for true crime cases from viewers' own hometowns, so let us know where you are and we may end up covering a case near you. Now, let's go back to where this story really begins. Deanna Stewart was 38 years old, a mother of 2 daughters, living in East El Paso, Texas. She had built a life around her family, working to support her girls, 16-year-old Adriana and her older daughter Diamond. For 8 or 9 years, Deanna had been in a relationship with a man named Greg Dudley. They weren't legally married, but under Texas law, their long-term relationship qualified as a common-law marriage. To the outside world, they were a couple who had been together for the better part of a decade, sharing a home, raising Deanna's daughters together, the kind of long-term domestic partnership that neighbors and extended family had simply come to accept as permanent. By 2015, Dudley wasn't a new presence in these girls' lives. He had been there for the majority of Adriana's childhood, present for school mornings and family routines, someone woven into the daily fabric of the household on Jerry Lewis Way. That's part of what makes the events of April 2015 so difficult to reconcile. This wasn't a stranger. This wasn't even a new boyfriend still being sized up by a wary family. This was a man who had shared a home, a bed, and a set of responsibilities with Deanna for nearly a decade. But inside that home, according to the people who knew them best, things were far from peaceful. Diamond, Deanna's older daughter, had lived with the couple for a period of years and later described what that was actually like. She said living with Deanna and Dudley was rough because the two of them fought constantly. She told investigators she could hear them arguing through the walls every 2 or 3 nights, and it wasn't just yelling. She said she saw bruises on her mother's arms more than once. One incident in particular, from the summer of 2011, would later become a pivotal piece of evidence. Diamond called 911 that day after Deanna came running into her room, clearly distressed. Dudley tried to force his way through the door while Diamond was on the phone with the dispatcher, begging for police to come. On that recorded call, you can hear Deanna crying in the background while Diamond tells the operator that her mother's boyfriend had just hit her. Deanna's hand was bleeding. When police responded to that call, an officer spoke with both Dudley and Deanna. Dudley told the officer a different story. He said Deanna had been the one to attack him, slapping, scratching, and punching him while he was driving, and that he had bitten her on the forearm and near her hand just to get her to stop. When the officer spoke to Deanna, she gave the opposite account. Both of them had been drinking, and the officer, unable to sort out who had actually started it, ended up arresting Deanna instead of Dudley. The charge against her was later dropped by the district attorney's office. Dudley was never arrested for that incident at all. A year later, in September of 2012, police were called back to the same address. This time, Deanna had asked officers to come help her move her belongings out of the house. While there, an officer noted that Dudley admitted in his own words that he had grabbed Deanna by the thigh during an argument. The officer could see redness where he'd grabbed her and took photographs. Dudley was initially charged with assault. Once again, prosecutors ultimately declined to pursue the case. Then there was the incident Adriana remembered from when the family lived in an earlier home. She recalled hearing yelling and crying coming from her mother's bedroom. When she went to check, she found her mother on the floor holding her face, while Dudley stood over her with his fist clenched. Deanna had a red mark forming around her eye. Adriana wanted to call the police that night. Her mother asked her not to. Deanna's niece, Jackie, who lived nearby, would later describe the relationship in a single word: volatile. She said she'd picked Deanna up from the street more than once after arguments sent her walking out of the house. On one occasion, she picked her aunt up from a police station. This was the pattern of Deanna and Dudley's relationship in the years leading up to April of 2015. Not a single dramatic event, but years of smaller ones: arguments, injuries, apologies, and reconciliations, repeating themselves. And according to Adriana, something else had been happening more frequently in the months right before her mother's death. She told investigators that 2 to 3 times a week, during arguments, Dudley would raise his hand, shape it like a gun, and point it at Deanna. Nobody could have known at the time how much that detail would come to matter. It's worth pausing here because this is often where cases like this one turn. 2 separate police calls, 2 separate documented incidents, officers who saw injuries with their own eyes and wrote them into reports. And yet both times the outcome was the same: no lasting charges, no conviction. One time it was actually Deanna who ended up arrested, not Dudley, because the responding officer couldn't determine who had started the altercation. It's a familiar and frustrating pattern in domestic violence cases, where alcohol, conflicting accounts, and a lack of independent witnesses can make it nearly impossible for police to act decisively in the moment. The system had 2 chances to intervene in a meaningful way before 2015. Both times, the case quietly closed, and life at the house on Jerry Lewis Way went on. Friday, April 10th, 2015, started like an ordinary morning. Deanna and Dudley took Adriana to a doctor's appointment, then dropped her off at school. It was a normal routine. Nothing that suggested anything was about to change. Adriana left school that afternoon and began the walk home, the same walk she'd made countless times before. As she approached the house, she noticed the screen door and the wooden front door were both partway open. That alone was unusual enough to catch her attention. As she reached for the door to go inside, it closed on her hard, as if someone had shoved it shut from the other side. Through the door she heard Dudley's voice. "Wait 1 minute," he told her. When he finally stepped outside, he had his story ready. He and Deanna had argued, he said, and Deanna had left the house. He locked the door behind him so Adriana couldn't go inside, and told her they would drive around and look for her mother together. He did not take her looking for very long. Instead, he drove her to the home of Deanna's niece, Jackie. When they got there and Deanna wasn't home, Dudley left Adriana at Jackie's house and told her he would keep searching on his own. He never came back for her that day. Adriana stayed at Jackie's for the entire weekend. She tried calling and texting her mother constantly throughout Friday night and all day Saturday. Every single message went unanswered. For a teenage girl who knew her mother's habits, this alone was a red flag. Deanna didn't just disappear, but there was nothing yet that pointed to anything beyond a bad breakup, an argument that had gone further than usual. On Sunday, April 12th, with school starting again the next morning, Adriana called her older sister Diamond to come pick her up. Diamond arrived with their Aunt Dawn, and the 3 of them drove to the house on Jerry Lewis Way to get Adriana's things, and they assumed, finally find out what was going on with Deanna. Adriana unlocked the door. She let her Aunt Dawn step inside first. Adriana herself only came in long enough to drop her backpack before heading back out to grab a bag from her sister's car. She never made it back inside. Dawn came running out of the house. Witnesses would later describe her as frantic, screaming for someone to call the police. Inside on the floor was Deanna. There was blood around her body. She was not moving. Police arrived and confirmed what the family already feared. Deanna Stewart was dead. She had a single gunshot wound to her back. A knife was later found near her body, but investigators noted there was no blood on it, a detail that would matter later, once alternate explanations for her death started circulating. An autopsy performed by Dr. Janice Diaz-Cavalieri would determine that Deanna's manner of death was homicide. But by the time her body was found on Sunday, the medical examiner would also note something else: signs of decomposition, insect activity in the body, evidence that Deanna had not just died that morning. She had likely been dead for some time, possibly since Friday, the very day Dudley locked Adriana out of the house and told her Deanna had walked away. Think about what that timeline means. For 2 full days, while Adriana sat at her cousin's house sending unanswered texts, while Dudley drove around the city, was seen slumped over a steering wheel in a parked car, and eventually turned up at his brother's house, Deanna's body had already been lying on the floor of the home the two of them shared. The search Dudley claimed to be conducting, the story he told a 16-year-old girl on her own front porch, had never been a search at all. While the investigation into Deanna's death was just beginning, detectives started pulling apart what Dudley had actually done in the hours and days after she disappeared. Cell phone records told a very different story than the one Dudley had given Adriana on the porch. At 1:46 in the afternoon on that Friday, the same day Deanna vanished, Dudley sent a text message to his son. It read simply, "I am going away for a bit. I love you guys, behave." Minutes later, in another message, he wrote that he was going away for a long time. Those aren't the words of a man whose girlfriend has just stormed out after an argument. Those are the words investigators would later argue came from someone who already knew what had happened and knew there was no coming back from it. Cell tower data placed Dudley's phone at the home at 2:27 that same afternoon, consistent with him being there around the time Deanna was killed. Over the following 2 days, his phone showed him moving through various locations across El Paso. At one point, police actually encountered him, sitting alone in a parked vehicle with his head down on the steering wheel. They questioned him for suspected drunk driving, not realizing at the time that they were looking at a man who, investigators would later allege, had already killed the mother of the girl he dropped off at a relative's house 2 days earlier. By Sunday, with Deanna's body discovered and the investigation now a homicide case, police tracked Dudley down at his brother's house. He was brought in for questioning. It didn't take long before he was placed under arrest. As the case developed, investigators built a picture that went beyond the timeline and the text messages. Forensic testing on Dudley's clothing turned up gunshot residue, not just on the jacket he'd been wearing, but on a second jacket found in his bedroom. A forensic scientist with the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab explained to the jury that gunshot residue doesn't linger long once it's transferred onto skin, but clothing can hold onto it much longer, sometimes for days, especially if the item isn't washed or handled extensively. He testified that after roughly 4 hours, most gunshot residue transferred to skin would already be gone, which is part of why no hand swab testing had been useful or even attempted by the time Dudley was taken into custody days later. For investigators, that residue on 2 separate jackets became a key piece of physical evidence tying Dudley directly to the shooting, evidence that didn't depend on anyone's memory or anyone's willingness to testify. It was evidence that had been sitting in his own closet. The defense, when the case eventually reached trial, pushed back hard on that evidence. They pointed out that no gunshot residue testing had ever been done on Dudley's hands, only his clothes, and argued the residue could have transferred from someone else entirely, or that Dudley could have put the jacket on at some point after the shooting for reasons that had nothing to do with guilt. The forensic scientist himself admitted under cross-examination that once he'd found residue on the first jacket, he considered it sufficient proof and didn't bother testing the rest of Dudley's clothing, a decision the defense seized on as evidence of a rushed and incomplete investigation. Investigators also zeroed in on motive. According to prosecutors, Dudley believed Deanna had been carrying on a 2-year affair with a man named Marcus Flores, a former neighbor. Whether or not that suspicion was true, prosecutors argued it didn't need to be. What mattered was what Dudley believed, and what he was allegedly willing to do because of it. That gesture Adriana had described, Dudley's hand shaped like a gun, pointed at her mother 2 to 3 times a week during arguments in the months before the murder, took on a very different meaning once prosecutors laid out that alleged motive for the jury. What might have once sounded like an exaggerated, angry gesture during a fight suddenly looked, in hindsight, like something closer to a rehearsal. The defense offered an entirely different theory. They argued that Deanna's death may have had nothing to do with Dudley at all, suggesting it could have been the result of a burglary or even a drug deal that went wrong, pointing to allegations that Deanna had used cocaine. It was an alternate explanation meant to plant reasonable doubt, an attempt to show that violence could have come from somewhere else entirely, a stranger, rather than the man who had shared her home for nearly a decade. But that theory ran into a problem almost immediately. A knife had been recovered near Deanna's body, the kind of detail that might support a burglary gone wrong narrative. Except investigators testified there was no blood on that knife at all, and the defense's own cross-examination of the crime scene officer revealed something else that cut both ways. The defense pointed out that there were several items in the house police never collected as evidence, suggesting the initial scene investigation had gaps in it. It was a strategy aimed less at proving an alternate killer and more at raising doubt about how thoroughly the case had actually been built. The trial took place in El Paso in the spring of 2017, nearly 2 years after Deanna's death. Over the course of the proceedings, the jury heard from both of Deanna's daughters. Diamond described years of fighting inside the home. Adriana, only 16 at the time of her mother's death, was asked directly during the defense's questioning whether she wanted to see Dudley found guilty. Her answer was simple. She said she wanted justice for her mother. Whoever had done this, she said, she wanted them to be exactly where they were supposed to be. It's worth sitting with that answer for a moment, because it's not the answer of a girl who had already made up her mind out of anger or grief alone. It's the answer of someone who had clearly thought about the possibility that the man sitting across the courtroom from her might not be guilty, and who was still willing to leave that door open, even while testifying against him. That kind of restraint, coming from someone who had lost her mother and been lied to by the man responsible, said as much about the case as any piece of forensic evidence. The jury also heard the 911 call from 2011, Deanna crying in the background while her own daughter begged for police to come. They heard from the officer who documented Dudley admitting he'd grabbed Deanna during another argument the following year. They heard from Jackie, describing a relationship she called volatile, describing the times she picked her aunt up off the street, and once, from a police station. The defense fought to keep much of this history out of the trial entirely, arguing it amounted to nothing more than character attacks, evidence of Dudley's past that had no direct bearing on what happened on April 10, 2015. But during opening statements, the defense had described Dudley and Deanna as an ordinary couple, folks like anyone else, and argued there was no sign of any blow-up between them on the day Deanna disappeared. Prosecutors argued that framing itself opened the door, that the state now had the right to respond with the truth about what their relationship had actually looked like behind closed doors. The trial court agreed, and the jury heard it all. The state also fought to include 2 crime scene photographs showing Deanna's body as it was found, one showing her blood-soaked shirt, another showing her face along with part of her exposed torso. The defense argued the images were too graphic, too likely to inflame the jury rather than inform them, and pointed out that the state had already introduced roughly 23 other photographs of the crime scene that also showed portions of Deanna's body, arguing these two additional images were simply piling on unnecessary and unfairly prejudicial material. The court allowed the photographs, while restricting the display of a portion of one image, and the medical examiner used the pictures to walk the jury through key details, including the pattern of lividity, the pooling of blood in Deanna's face after death, which helped pinpoint how long she had already been gone before she was found. That single detail, the fixed lividity visible in the photograph, became one of the more technical but important pieces of the state's case, because it helped establish that Deanna had died well before Sunday, directly undercutting any theory that placed her death later, closer to when her body was actually discovered. During closing arguments, prosecutors were direct with the jury. What happened to Deanna Stewart, they argued, was not an accident, not a break-in, not a drug deal gone wrong. Someone killed her on purpose, and they meant to do it. The jury agreed. Greg Dudley was convicted of murder. At sentencing, Deanna's family filled the courtroom. When the sentence was read, 80 years in prison, along with a $10,000 fine, family members embraced each other and cried. They told reporters afterward that they finally felt justice had been served. For Adriana, the girl who once stood outside a closing door, waiting to be let back into her own home, that 80-year sentence closed a chapter that began the moment her mother stopped answering her calls. For a 16-year-old who had spent an entire weekend hoping her mother would simply call her back, the verdict didn't undo any of it. But it meant that the man who had shut that door in her face would not be walking free to tell his version of events again. Dudley didn't let the conviction stand without a fight. He appealed, arguing that the trial court had made two critical errors, first by allowing the jury to hear about his past history of violence with Deanna, and second by allowing the crime scene photographs into evidence. His attorneys argued both pieces of evidence were more prejudicial than they were useful, and that together, they had denied him a fair trial. The Eighth Court of Appeals in El Paso disagreed on every point. The court found that Dudley's own defense strategy, painting the couple's relationship as ordinary and free of conflict, had opened the door to the state's rebuttal evidence. Beyond that, the court found the history of violence was directly relevant under Texas law, which specifically allows prosecutors in murder cases to present evidence of the relationship between a defendant and a victim, because that relationship can reveal motive and intent. As for the photographs, the court ruled they were not shown for shock value. They helped the jury understand the medical examiner's findings and the true condition in which Deanna's body was discovered. The appellate court affirmed the conviction in full. Dudley's 80-year sentence stood. That appeal is actually the reason this case remains on the public record in such detail. Appellate opinions like the one written in Dudley's case lay out, point by point, exactly what evidence a jury heard and why. It's a rare window into a trial most people would otherwise only know through a handful of local news headlines. A case that made regional television for a few days in 2017, and then quietly faded from the news cycle once sentencing was over. But buried inside that appellate ruling is the full weight of what Deanna Stewart's daughters had to sit through in that courtroom, described in the flat, procedural language of the law, stripped of everything except what could be proven. The appellate judges made a point of noting that the trial court's decisions fell within what the law calls a zone of reasonable disagreement, legal language for saying that even if reasonable people might have ruled differently on where exactly to draw the line, the trial judge hadn't abused his discretion in allowing the evidence in. It's a technical standard, but it mattered enormously here, because it meant the appellate court wasn't required to agree that admitting every piece of history and every photograph was the only correct call. They only had to find that it was a defensible one, and on every count Dudley raised, they found that it was. What stands out most about this case isn't a single dramatic twist. It's the pattern that preceded the tragedy. 2 prior police calls to the same address. A niece who used the word volatile to describe what she'd witnessed for years. A daughter who grew used to the sound of her mother crying through a bedroom wall. Small warning signs, each one on its own dismissed, argued over, unprosecuted until April of 2015, when they added up to something that could never be taken back. Cases like this one rarely announce themselves in advance. There was no single incident so severe that it forced anyone to intervene decisively. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of smaller moments, moments that individually could be explained away, blamed on alcohol, blamed on mutual conflict, blamed on the messiness of a long relationship, until they weren't isolated anymore. They were a pattern. And patterns, when they're finally recognized in hindsight, are almost always visible only after it's too late to change what happened. Deanna Stewart was 38 years old. She was a mother who raised two daughters, one of whom stood on a porch just days before finding out her mother would never come home again. Her death became a case study in how the smaller, quieter incidents of violence in a relationship can be the clearest warning of what's still to come. If this case moved you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Give this video a like, drop a comment letting us know your thoughts, and share it with anyone who appreciates real true crime stories told the right way.